Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about the Phoenix Button Enigma. We're going to look into these Phoenix buttons and follow them around the country, and hopefully this will give us a little insight into some of our lost history. So let's get started. Now, these Phoenix buttons were intended to be used on military uniforms for King Christophe of Haiti, and he unfortunately passed in 1820, so they no longer needed these buttons. So what happened to these buttons after Christophe's death is unknown until 1832, when they were purchased by Nathaniel Wyeth. So Nathaniel Wyeth buys these buttons, we're told, in the 1830s, and he sets up a trading location along the Columbia River. And these buttons just start showing up all along the west coast of the United States. And estimates by academics and other researchers indicate that somewhere around 1,000 of these Phoenix buttons have turned up over the past 150 years or so. And I think the greatest concentration of the 1,000 plus that have been found are along the Columbia River. Okay, so far nothing seems too out of sort. But getting back to these coins, so they can be found all along the west coast of the United States. And here are just some that were found in a village very close to Fort Vancouver, and also some were found in Fort Vancouver. And you can see how significantly buried a lot of these artifacts are. And I think the running total of artifacts at Fort Vancouver is 2.8 million artifacts. And the inscription on these buttons, and I think they come in like two different types in a few different sizes, but the translation from French, I believe, is I am reborn from my ashes. So far, okay, I mean, so what, right? They're showing up at a few of these different locations up and down the west coast, and this is just some of the sites in California. And here you have Oregon and Washington, and again, the greatest concentration of these buttons are along the Columbia River. And before I get to the focus in on one particular site, I just want to mention they found these buttons in Alaska, Castle Hill. This Castle Hill site, there was a Russian fort there, and I guess these are the only known examples from Alaska or north of the Columbia River. So they're finding these things all the way up in Alaska, and even on one of the Hawaiian islands at this Russian Fort Elizabeth, they found two more of these Phoenix buttons. And I think that was in the 70s they found that. So they have traveled long distances, and on the East Coast, they find some of these Phoenix buttons, but I think that this one's from Maine, I believe. I think the numbers of the buttons that have been found are I think they're in the dozens. Like, I'm not sure if they've hit 100 yet, as opposed to the 1,000 plus on the West Coast of the United States. So here's where things get interesting. Well, apparently these buttons have been recovered at all the missions in California and Pueblo sites and some ranchos. Well, the thing about the mission sites is that a lot of them were closed down in the 1830s, but they found some of these Phoenix buttons at this particular mission as well, Santa Cruz mission. And in the 80s, they found an adobe site. They call it the Lost Adobe. And they found some of these buttons that were buried. And getting back to the missions, between 1834 and 1836, the Mexican government confiscated California mission properties and exiled the Franciscan friars. So what's interesting about this is that supposedly that Nathaniel Wyeth person bought these buttons in 1832, sets up shop, and somehow in a couple of years they show up at all these mission sites buried. Some of them are, significantly buried, in only a couple years before all these missions get shut down, basically. Doesn't seem likely, but just first thing that I wanted to mention. Now, another thing I want to point out is there are these Native American villages that were also around Fort Vancouver, and they find these Phoenix buttons. And one of these villages in particular I want to look at, and that's Cathlapodal. And the thing about a lot of these Native American villages, they were decimated by a great pestilence that raged from 1830 to 1835. So a lot of these villages had been abandoned Yet they still have these buttons, and a lot of these villages are buried like 4 to 6 feet. So we're going to look at this one village, and there were archaeological excavations in the 1990s, but they uncovered more of these phoenix buttons. So I find it interesting that a lot of these villages were decimated by pestilence. I think they were buried long before the 1830s, in my opinion. And this archaeologist, he was giving some of his thoughts about this site, and he just talks about how the first Europeans to come across this particular area was in 1792. Now, one of the things that surprised him is that they found during their excavations copper and iron pieces and a chunk of Chinese porcelain, all of which were at the village about a century before Vancouver arrived in 1792. So in the 1600s, these artifacts have showed up at this village site, which is partially buried. So he believes that these items came from a crashed European ship. I think there was an extensive trade network that was in effect, and that's why they're finding this stuff, and that's why the site's buried, because there was some sort of disaster. And another thing that was an unexpected discovery for him anyway was that many of these houses had large underground cellars where they find, again, most of these artifacts. So I think these cellars might not be cellars, just like we've seen in other sites. And here you can see some of these archaeological excavations in the 1990s. But I was just coming across some more information about some of these excavations, and they find some interesting artifacts like this metal sword. And in this article, they were just describing this artifact that appears to have been plunged deliberately into the ground in one of these plank houses. I just think it was buried due to some unknown event. While things like copper bracelets and beads appear to have been lost during use, this sword seems intentionally placed, and although no one knows why, other artifacts placement in the floor or in plank house wall trenches also appear purposeful. So they think this stuff was purposely buried, basically. I think it's all the result of this event that we don't know anything about. When that is, I'm still not sure, but these dates are all wrong in my opinion, and I think there was extensive trade that, again, we're not being told about. Well, what about Lewis and Clark? Because it turns out the famous expedition from 1804 to 1806, they come through the Columbia River, and they actually visit this village, we're told. Lewis and Clark visited this buried village, Cathlapodal, trading with the people for several hours. Then they camped at a nearby place. And then you also find out that approximately 40 years after Lewis and Clark departed, this site was abandoned. The building slowly vanished and the site became covered with vegetation. Now that's the way they're explaining it. I think it was destroyed, and we're being given a false history. Well, we have Lewis and Clark telling us what the real story is, so we can just trust them, right? Well, maybe not, because again, Lewis and Clark, they're not just any two random people. They're both fraternal brothers of Freemasonry, and Lewis of Lewis and Clark was a master mason. So it's not just any people who are giving us these firsthand accounts, and this was just one of the emblems associated with their expedition. And I think it was like a group of 40 plus people who were specially established unit of the United States Army. Yeah, they were referred to as the Corps of Discovery. So just an interesting history with these Phoenix buttons, and they're showing up at a lot of these sites that we're told are from like the 1800s, early to mid 1800s, but I think they're much older. And another aspect to some of these buttons is some of them are actually stamped with a manufacturer stamp on the back of them. I think it says Bushby, London, and at least according to some research, no records have been found on this English company. So whether they were the only maker is unclear. Just another interesting dynamic to this whole thing. So speaking of the American Northwest, is there anything else that might indicate there was some sort of disaster along the West Coast during this early colonial period? Well, that's when you get into the ghost forest phenomenon. They've been finding these ghost forests, which they think were destroyed during a tsunami. They put it around the year 1700. but they find these ghost forests in Oregon and also in Washington state as well. So there appears to have been something that did happen in these areas. That's what I think affected these sites along the Columbia River as well. But then what about the East Coast? Is there anything early colonial period? Was there anything going on as far as accumulation of sediment on the East Coast? Yeah, that's where you get into this muddy legacy along a lot of streams and rivers. There's just all this sediment that is accumulated. And I think in 2009, they determined that it was colonial era tampering that resulted in these sites being covered under yards of silt. So we see on the East Coast, all these sites are buried under feet of sediment. And what about along the southeast? Any cities along the southeast that would have appeared to have been affected by this disaster? Well, Charleston, this early walled city, is now below grade, and it was built on top of, we're told, in like the 1780s or something. But I think the reason why it's buried, once again, this overarching event. And then what about the northeast of the United States? Any buried sites there along the coast? Well, you have the Dutch colony, New Amsterdam. New York City was once New Amsterdam. Yeah, New York City sits on top of this former colony, and I think they found traces of this colonial period 10 feet below Battery Park. They found this wall. So I think this is all just tying together. And speaking of the Dutch, well, what about the Dutch East India Company? They were dissolved in 1799, but if we look at this Dutch colonial city called Batavia, which was also in Jakarta, there was this fortress, Batavia Fortress, this bastion fort. A lot of this city is buried now, and this fort is buried. And there have been more recent excavations to unearth this fort. Once again, it's just this overarching pattern, and we're told in this case that the fortress was intentionally destroyed in 1809, along with a lot of other buildings in the old town. So here we're told it was intentionally destroyed. But I think it's the same event, and also every video I have to mention Australia. But this early colonial period, once again, it's buried, and we're told the reason why it's buried is because the street levels were raised. But unfortunately, the historians, the archaeologists forgot that the street levels were raised until 2017. So I just hope that it's becoming clear that they're hiding this secondary event from us. I think there was another event that took out what we call the Roman Empire. And then there's this more recent event that took out a lot of these colonial period sites. But when exactly did it happen? I still don't know. I'm looking into it. But speaking of the Phoenix phenomenon here with regards to buttons and coins along the East Coast, again, we have Jamestown in Virginia, and there's a ton of archaeology going on there. And this is another, early colonial period site, and they find a lot of these coins, and one of the coins is referred to as the crowned phoenix token. So these could be used in lieu of currency, but I believe there's a Latin inscription which translates to only one phoenix in the world. And this particular token is one of more than 20 found at Jamestown that depict a crowned rose on one side. They're associating it with Queen Elizabeth I's reign. So again, just a lot of people wanting to put these phoenixes on coins, buttons, and it seems to be associated with this early colonial period. So I wanted to mention these tokens as well. But I think I'll leave it here for today. And what I want to do is just give a big shout out to all my patrons. Thank you again for all your help and support. I really appreciate it. And with that being said, until next time, take care. Bye.